Can you all hear me okay? Sweet. So I'm not sure if I should apologize for not speaking any German. I didn't realize that the other talks were going to be in German, but at least I have some pretty architecture pictures, so I can reference talks in other ways a bit later on, so we'll see how that goes. Awesome. So one of my best friends is actually from Germany. He grew up in Zollingen, and he said to me, when I told him I was coming here, he says to me, ooh, I'm like, what does that mean? He says, be very, very careful. He says, which side of the river are you going? So I showed him on a map, and he said, cool, order the alt beer. I'm like, So, I have the right one? Yeah. I've noticed a couple of people do this thing when you open it, and I opened it like an idiot. So, what's the trick? You just push on the top. On here. Yeah? Cool. That's tasty. Someone's enjoying at the back. That's good. Awesome. Cool. So, as you may have guessed from my accent, I don't know how many Swedish people you know, but living in Stockholm, I'm not Swedish. I originally come from South Africa. How many of you have had the privilege of going there? Sweden or South Africa? South Africa. We'll start there first. Cool. A couple of hands. Good. Nice. How many of you been to Sweden? Cool. Sweet. I'm going to overdo the hands thing. It's one of the ways that I like to get responses from the audience, so bear with me. If your arms get tired, switch your beer to the other hand or something. You'll be okay. So, how many of you know of Spotify? Ah, there we go. I knew I'd get all the hands eventually. How many of you are using Spotify? It's close to the same number. How many of you pay for Spotify? Yes. So I like to joke and say, if you really like the talk, subscribe, and then I can come back next year. We'll see how that goes. Cool. So I've traveled around quite a bit, been to a number of conferences, and I meet a lot of people, and they say, we've heard all these things about Spotify, and it's really great. Sounds like you've solved all the problems in the world. And I'm like, maybe. We've solved some things. Some of them maybe less well. But a lot of people have seen the videos, they've seen the talks, they've seen, maybe you've been to the office, you've seen a bunch of stuff that we're up to. There's definitely a lot of interesting things, but I'll tell you straight up, like, we definitely haven't solved all the problems. There's no magic rainbows and ponies running around the office. There's still a lot of work to do. We'll get there one day. But yeah, I think it's really interesting because a lot of people try to sort of take bits and pieces from the stuff that we've put out there. And while I think it's really interesting that people draw inspiration from what we're doing, it's also a good idea to understand that there's maybe a little bit more behind the scenes that is not kind of captured in a single document or a piece of paper or a single talk and so on. Yeah. The down one. I want to start just give you a little bit of context of Spotify and sort of paint a picture of how the company sort of fits together. So we currently operate in about 58 markets around the world. I cannot confirm or deny where we will be next, so if you ask questions later, unfortunately, that's one I can't answer. Unfortunately not. I get so much grief every time I speak to my friends. When's Spotify coming? I'm like... So, around 58 markets in the world. There will be more in the future, but as I say, it's a pretty big organization. We have around 75 million customers, which is quite a large number. I was chatting to some of the guys earlier from InVision and telling them that one of the teams I was working with, just to kind of put this in context, is they deal with a lot of client event logging, and they're ingesting around about 40 to 50 terabytes of events per day, just the event logging. Like that's kind of a big number. So think 58 markets, think 75 million users. It's quite big. One of the things that makes us unique about the way that we're working, I managed to pick up some bits and pieces from the story that was being told earlier about how kind of this evolution has happened over time. And one of the things with Spotify is that it's actually 5 years ago, it's just ticked over, so you'll have to forgive me the minor off by one error. Nothing serious happens from off by one errors, eh? We'll just round up to the nearest 5. So we had around 30 people working on engineering in a single location. Fairly easy. It's not that hard. Maybe. Today, 100+ teams. We're around 750, 800 in engineering alone. Company's about 1,800 people, and we split across 5 locations from engineering, where we have offices in about 30 different countries for sales, marketing, and so on. So as you can imagine, this is quite a big operation, and there's a lot of change. If you think about that trajectory of 4 years, from pretty small to pretty big. There was a stage not so long ago, just around the time I joined Spotify, where we're doubling in size about every 6 to 9 months in terms of employees. And if you can imagine that, like, there's a lot of strange things that start to happen in that sort of situation. But I think we've done a really good job of keeping up with it. But I want to kind of set the stage. How many of you have seen this picture before? This is going to be interesting. Cool. So this is a model called Cynefin. It's a framework for complexity. Essentially, it's a systems theory idea. And basically, the idea is that you get different types of systems, right? If you want to read about it, the guy who came up with this is called Dave Snowden. He's very smart, very opinionated, and very funny to watch. I recommend his videos. The company's called Cognitive Edge. But basically, what you have is on the left side over there, you have ordered systems, things that you can kind of predict and understand. If you spend enough time looking at them and understanding the moving parts, you can make sense and sort of start to predict what they're going to do. On the left side, however, you have complex and chaotic systems. So chaotic systems kind of acting at random, no real cause and effect. Complex systems, you can understand the cause and effect relationship, but only after it's happened, right? So what I want to do is kind of frame this with the idea that basically what we're talking about is, what I'm going to talk to you about today, is almost nothing in the obvious space. So it's not somewhere where you can take a best practice, pick it up, copy and paste it. It's more kind of in the complicated or complex space and maybe kind of blending between the two. I won't bore you with too much theory around this, but basically what it is that you have to experiment and try stuff, see what works, and if it works, you can kind of stabilize the constraints and keep doing it. So imagine you try a model with a team, you work in a certain way, it starts to work really well, you use it in another context, it works there as well. Pretty soon you try using it maybe all over the organization. But you will always run into situations where it doesn't make sense. Yeah? Cool. So this is the famous picture that everybody who's seen any of our papers. How many of you have seen this picture before? Yeah? I'll give a very quick overview for those of you who haven't seen it. Essentially, the organization started growing and we got to a point where we had to find ways to kind of divide things up a little bit. We couldn't have everybody working on everything. I would say from my experience of working in other companies, that number is probably somewhere between 55 and 150. That's where you start to run into issues. Not everybody can know everyone. Systems become too complex. There's just too much stuff on the go and you have to start to divide it up in some way. This was not the first thing that we tried, but it was one of the ones that stuck around for longer than a few minutes. And so we decided to write about it, share it with the world. The idea was basically put it out there and let people try it, see what works. Share it with the world, let them interrogate it, throw ideas at it, tell us what sucks. Maybe they draw some inspiration. Essentially what you have is you have squads. Squads are really just a team. There's a little bit of a story behind how we picked the naming for these things. So squad is a team, a chapter is kind of a center of excellence or a community of practice, if you will. Guilds and chapters are kind of similar, but chapters are also a reporting line. And then tribe is kind of a group of squads. Yeah? Did I go too quickly on that? No? So the reason we picked different names for this is that we decided that we wanted to imbue slightly different meaning on these words. So if you think of a department, for example, everybody thinks, oh, a department is like this. There's one person at the top, and they tell everybody what to do, and everybody reports up the line, and all the shit flows downhill, and basically it's a standard process. And we wanted to make sure that we weren't doing this, so we decided to pick some different names so that we could, when new people join, they go, hang on, what's this tribe thing? And we can have a bit of a conversation about the subtle differences. So we don't really have a concrete definition written down beyond what's in this paper. And we don't really even refer to the paper, to be honest, that much. But it allows us to have a conversation and the ideas spread through storytelling. So a lot of people talk about this as a model. But the thing about models is that all of them are wrong at some point or in some context. However, as I said, some of them are useful. So the thing I want to emphasize about this is that it's a snapshot in time. It was a somewhat simplified version of the way we work. I mean, how many of you do you think you would be able to describe everything that happens in your company inside one document? So I've had all the hands and no the hands. I'll tick that one off. Yeah, just a snapshot. It's really just a point in time, and a lot of things have changed. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a little bit of that over the course of today. So basically, I'm going to cover some of the things that we avoid doing because those are not covered in the paper. I'll explain a little bit about why we avoid them and how we think about it differently. I'll also tell you some of the things that we've tried to do instead and why we chose them, basically. And then I'll try to spend a lot of the time talking about what's changed and kind of why we've changed it and what we've learned along the way. Yeah. So I like to do this sort of a little bit more interactive. So if there's anything that I explained that or said that didn't make sense, or you didn't follow what I was saying, or you think I'm just talking rubbish, stick up a hand, ask a question. I don't mind stopping halfway through. It'll be okay. Cool. But there will be time for questions at the end if you prefer to wait and see maybe I'll answer it halfway through or something. So. Before I get into kind of all of that, I want to give you a little bit of a picture of what it is like at Spotify, just kind of a few anecdotes that you can get a sort of a feel, and maybe try to sort of, I don't know, I wouldn't say close your eyes, but imagine that you're at Spotify and it's -15 and snowing like it was this morning when I left, and it gets dark at 3 in the afternoon, like this kind of dark at 3 in the afternoon. Those are the downsides. The upsides of summer is the exact opposite of that. Yeah. So this is inside our cafeteria. There's a bunch of people hanging out. Basically, we were running a sort of an onboarding exercise during our boot camp. These are a bunch of new hires that joined the company. We spend about 2 weeks on boot camp and a couple of days doing some other onboarding activities. Basically just hanging out, having some fun, learning about how we work and kind of inducting people into the way that we think about things at Spotify. This is a picture of our IT service desk, right? This is, a lot of companies would have maybe, I mean, you guys were saying something about not having any cables and so on. I'm sorry, but we have quite a lot of cables around our office. A lot of people insist on using all kinds of strange computers, and we have to have adapters for things and stuff. But contrary to what a lot of companies would do is you would have to maybe sign a form or ask permission or go talk to somebody. This is in a hallway where there's a giant thoroughfare. There's a giant pile of everything from mouse pads to Apple chargers to adapters for your phone to basically any part that you would need to plug into your computer that's not the computer itself is on this desk, and you can just go and grab whatever you need. And what I like particularly about this, because a lot of people come and do the tour, look around the office, and they go, wow, that's really cool. And I'm like, you haven't seen anything yet. Like, this is just a small part of it. But what I really like about this was one of the guys who's responsible for the stock control behind this. He did some maths. I don't know if he was bored or just had, trying to fuel his nightmares or something. But he basically, he worked out that we'd ordered some very scary number worth of Apple chargers for our computers, and a lot of people had second chargers and so on. And in a lot of companies, what would happen is somebody would start to say, oh, well, that's enough. We've spent however many million crowns worth of money on these chargers. His solution to this was he gets up at one of the all hands and he says, guys, I'm starting this new project. It's called Project Lollipop. I have a giant big box of lollipops over here. If you bring me any computer parts that you're not using, I'll give you a lollipop. Yeah? I will say that that box of lollipops probably got the highest return on investment of any expenditure in the company ever. Apple cinema displays and like all kinds of crazy stuff. But the point is, when you think about the system and you take a systemic view, you can kind of get an idea of what incentives are at play. I mean, a lollipop's not a big reward. I mean, especially not compared to the value of the items, but just something like people like, oh, they weren't thinking about that stuff that was sitting there next to them on the desk or in their squad room or something. But cool example. There's a lot of humor around the company. This is one of our values. And that pink post-it note has been taken down by the cleaners and other people a couple of times, and it just keeps coming back. I don't know why. I think it's awesome. Our office is built sort of, I described it like a donut, and then I found out that I was also talking to the architect who designed the building, and they were like, it's not a donut, it's some fancy word. It's basically got a hole in the middle, yeah? And when we moved in, we decided to put like, you know, like mini golf, basically, almost, but without the hole. We didn't put that part. We just put the floor. We put these nice hammocks and stuff, and in the summer there's some nice trees and so on. These are two guys hanging out in the most visible point in the company. This is head office at Spotify, the most visible point in the middle of the day. Everyone's supposed to be working. They're lying on the lazy boys. And a lot of people are like, why? What's going on? Turns out these two are actually having a one-on-one. The manager on the left and one of the engineers on the right. And that's the type of space that they chose. We're going to go hang out in the sun. Like, you got to take advantage when it gets dark at 3 in the winter. As soon as the sun's out in summer, you see Swedes standing. There's like a tiny ray of sunlight, and they're like, ah. That's basically what they're doing. But I think the picture I'm trying to paint here is that there's not a lot of people kind of running around worrying about things. There's no timesheets. There's no check-ins. There's no security control. There's no like, I mean, you have access control of the door so that you know weird people don't wander in and steal your stuff. But like beyond that, like things are open. We've broken down the barriers. We've enabled people to kind of get what they need and taken all of the other stuff out the way. And one last picture, just because I love this joke so much. This kind of stuff is all over the office. You walk into a meeting room and this is just randomly stuck on a wall or something like that. And it's quite a stark contrast. I was saying to the guys from InVision today that this office is really tidy. They also told me that they tidied up this morning. But I imagine that it's pretty tidy most of the time. Spotify, by contrast, is kind of a creative chaos, maybe, is what I would call it. There's a lot of stuff just kind of around. There's a lot of post-its on the wall, a lot of diagrams and so on. Sometimes we clean it up, but there's also a lot of like character, a lot of personality. Like you walk in and you really get a sense of what's going on. People kind of, everything is on display. And I really like that. I want to tell you a short story about a company that I was told, the last time I told this story in Germany, I was told, don't talk about Toyota in Germany. I don't know why, but apparently you're not supposed to do that, but I'm going to do it anyway because I really like the story. There's a story, how many of you know that Toyota, when they originally started, they used to make weaving machines? Yeah? 1 or 2 nodding heads? Long, long, long before they made motor cars or anything like that. Back in the day, there was, basically they'd built one of the most revolutionary machines, and one of the sort of junior managers came to one of the execs one day and he's in a flat panic. Our competitors have stolen our designs, we're doomed. And the executive's like, why? I don't understand. It's like, well, they've stolen our designs, like they're going to copy us and they'll be able just as good as us. And he says, nah, that's not the deal. He says, think about it, like we're constantly iterating on this design, right? So let's say it takes them a year, right, to operationalize this machine. Now they've got one in production. So now we're a year ahead. Takes them another year to figure out that we're actually iterating on the design, and what they have is last year's model, right? Now we're 2 years ahead. Takes them another year, optimistically, to learn how to iterate on this machine. Now we're 3 years ahead, yeah? People ask me, why is it that we stand up and talk about what Spotify is doing? Can't we just copy it, paste it into our org, and like, it's just like this. It's the iteration, it's the continuous improvement. It's not the individual artifacts or the things that I'm going to talk to you about today. It's more about the journey. It's the way we think about it and the constant iteration that's important. Okay? Essentially, the idea is we want to be the best at getting better. And I would say that we're pretty close. I mean, the best is perhaps a hard mark to measure. But the rate of change and the amount of experiments that we're running at any given time is really phenomenal. And I think it's really, really powerful. So I could stop the talk here and go home, and that's basically it. But I'll go into a bit more detail because I think it's interesting. So I said I was going to tell you about a couple of things that we don't do and explain a bit of why that is. So one of the things that we like to avoid is punishing failure, right? How many of you have worked in an organization where somebody makes a giant mistake and then tomorrow they're not at work? Have you ever seen that happen? Yeah? It's kind of weird, I find. It's a really great quote from Chris Argyris. Yeah? People all for the truth unless it's embarrassing or threatening. And really the idea that we're going for is not saying like, just let anybody run around and do whatever they want. Like, system has rules, it has constraints, it has boundaries. Those are a good idea if you want to try to shape an organization. But if people are scared of making the most tiny little mistake, you want to try to reduce the threat effect, right? So I want to give a small caveat on this, is that when we talk about failure, I'm talking about non-negligent failure, right? Somebody comes in and trashes the printer, that's pretty negligent. Somebody did something for the 17th time after you've spoken to them, maybe you need to have a different type of conversation. Essentially, we're talking about feedback loops, right? Not all feedback loops are as tasty as this box makes out, but they're really important, right? If you don't know what's going on, you don't know that you're making a mistake. Real-time feedback is the most important of these, I find. You tell me soon, I can adjust my behavior, change something, do something different next time. A lot of companies wait, they do performance appraisals every 6 months or a year. Why would you wait that long to tell somebody that they're making a mistake? I don't understand it. Or you do this kind of feedback loop. Yeah? Not very helpful either. So what we try to do is instead celebrate learning. A lot of companies will talk about it and they'll say, we want to celebrate failure. I hear this a lot. I don't know if that came out of the lean startup community or where that came from, but celebrate failure. Like, why is failure the thing you want to celebrate? Failure is a necessity. You have to make mistakes, right? If you're not trying new things, if you're not making mistakes, you're not trying anything new enough, not pushing the boundaries far enough. But what you want to celebrate, what you're going for is the learning. It's like that saying, have your cake and eat it too. What the hell's the point in the cake if you can't eat it? Doesn't make any sense. You have to have the learning with the failure, not just the failure. So I'll give an example of this. One of the guys at Spotify, he starts, and I've told a bunch of stories to the guys from InVision today. I hope they're not tired of me talking about data infrastructure, but I worked there for a little while, and it's a pretty interesting space. One of the guys starts, new guy is running some part of the Hadoop cluster, and I think he's been at Spotify maybe a week at most. He's making some changes, and he thinks he's on a test system or some sort of pre-production, makes a change, and next thing, bing, on his phone. He's like, as an engineer, you know that ping when you've just done something dangerous. Why that ping's not supposed to happen now? And all of a sudden, there's just like this deathly silence from behind me. I'm like, oh no, that's not good. So I'm like, what's going on, dude? I think I just took down half of Spotify. I'm like, why are you whispering? I don't want anyone to know. I just got here. Basically what happened was he turned to the guy next to him eventually after a bit of prodding and said, hey dude, this is what I think I've done. Turned out it wasn't that bad. It was about 10% of Europe, and it was only down for about 2 or 3 minutes. But what was most fascinating is it was IRC at the time. We've switched to Slack, but we were on IRC at the time, and immediately a bunch of people jump in and they're like, dude, that's nothing. This is what I did in my first week. And they start telling the story about it. Yeah? All kinds of fascinating stuff. But that's the kind of thing that I talk about. Like, you have to acknowledge the failure in order to be able to celebrate the learning. It's kind of a 2-step process, like a 1-2 punch. You've got to do both. Hero worship. I find it interesting. I did some consulting work before I came to Spotify. And I had this long conversation with the head of HR saying, like, what's the purpose of this performance appraisal system? They would go around once every quarter or something and put, I kid you not, giant gold stars suspended above people's desks. I said, why do you do this? No, we want to show appreciation to our people. I said, and what about the people who don't get a star? No, well, are they not appreciated? Like, I mean, if they suck that much, why don't you just fire them? Like, that would make sense. Like, no, we can't do that, we can't do that. We appreciate everyone. I'm like, yeah, but why do you single out those people? Turned out that basically the teams had figured this out and they were gaming the system because there was a prize attached to it. Some teams were doing it in different ways. Some of them were literally just trying to outshine each other, which is the common way. That's how people do it. Do all the glorious projects, suck up to the boss, something like that. One of the teams had figured out that it was possible to literally just round robin it because they could vote it. They were just, it's your turn, it's your turn. They had an Excel spreadsheet of who was next. Like, there's another quote I like. You know, system, it's not the sum of the parts, it's the product of the interactions. You're dealing with humans. A lot of knowledge in our heads. The way that we make things awesome is by combining it and blending it together. Product of interactions. Yeah? So why would you try to optimize each of the individual parts? It's the interactions, that's what's interesting. So we try to encourage collaboration. And there's a couple of different ways that we do this. And I know from the Envision guys, I saw some of their slides, and they explained a few of them in English earlier in the day, so that was nice. But we talked a little bit about a few things like the layout of the office. So I said human interaction as an example. People have to be able to talk to each other. Occasionally you have to have some sort of proximity to each other. It's a funny thing how humans there's a lot of communication. I don't know if you guys noticed this, but the amount of communication that's done non-verbally. You get on a Skype call or a voice call, you can hear the person, and you can understand what they're saying, but can you tell if they're really upset about the thing that you said? Or they kind of, while you're talking? It's really useful to be able to build a friendship and a relationship with people. So what we do is we send a lot of people on planes. It's actually a Lufthansa plane. I didn't know that. But basically we get on a plane, go to New York, go to Stockholm, go to Boston, go visit the teams, go have a beer with people. Talk to them, get to know them a little bit, build a relationship. It's amazing how much easier it is to work with people when you actually have some kind of communication with them beforehand. So this slide was actually in here before I realized that, do you know this building? You do know this one? You could probably guess the architect, yeah? It's Frank Gehry. This is the Weizmann Museum in Minneapolis. I kind of like architecture, so I was pretty excited to find out. I only found out actually after I was already coming here that there's a building just down the road. So yeah, I have to go take like a ridiculous selfie with duck face or something. We'll see how that goes. But basically, the point I'm trying to make with this is that you have to think about the structure of your organization. If you put everybody in silos and little boxes and you prevent them from speaking to each other through reporting lines or through strange kind of keeping information like over here because of your structure, it needs to, I think it's a beautiful building. A lot of people will tell you that it's maybe impractical or something like that, but I think it's really beautiful. When you think about the structure of your building, you have to, or your organization at least, you need to make sure that you've thought about it in terms of who needs to interact with who and how is that going to work. Try to put teams also nearby each other. So workspace design, if you look around here, like this is a really beautiful space. There's a lot of effort and thought that's gone into the thinking about how this workspace is laid out. Put together in a way so that people can collaborate. Nice big open tables, we can all sit around together. If we need to go into a room and have a private conversation, we've got a space for that. If everybody's at a cubicle and I can't talk to you privately about, I think I just killed Spotify, you might have some, communication loops that may just not be happening. There we go. Beer fixes everything. So we've put a lot of effort into all of these things, trying to think about it. We spend a lot of money on plane tickets. We get humans together, get them to talk to each other. We've put a lot of thought into how we design the office space. These are the kind of things that you can do. The other thing, is, as I said, is just physical proximity. All of our people who work regularly together sit right next to each other. And I think that that's so important. There's a lot of stuff about remote working and so on, and I think there are situations where that can make sense. But there's a lot of new things that you have to do, and we've chosen to make the investment in the other direction because we think it's better, easier, scales more, that sort of thing. But I've seen companies work the other way, but it's a different set of skills that you have to get good at. This is a challenging one, and it's something that we've kind of grappled with as an organization, is this idea of centralizing decision-making and control, right? And this comes down to everything from different technologies. So a little bit of a story from Spotify is that I was telling the guys earlier that we have this sort of, used to have a tendency, I would say we've kind of managed to get rid of it, to kind of just try anything. You want to use a new language? Go ahead. You want to have another code review tool? Go ahead. You want another build system? Sure, go for it. Pretty soon what we started to realize is that there is some value in centralizing. But if you try to centralize everything, you basically remove not only the information, but the actual responsibility for people to be able to make decisions. And so there's this fine balance between giving people autonomy and freedom and the capability to be able to do the stuff they want to do, and just letting everything run amok. So it's a useful tool, but like all tools and all models, they're wrong in certain contexts, but they can be useful. So be careful where you use it. The flip side of it is that often when you tell people to create autonomous teams is that they go this sort of route. Yeah? Basically, I've done my bit, it's your bit now. We made the strategic decisions, we decided where to invest, we hired the right people. Go be autonomous. Yeah? I find it fascinating, and there's a lot of stuff that could be said about how you build autonomous teams, but that's a whole nother talk. If you're interested in some of this, there's a concept, well, I'll get to it in 2 slides and then I'll explain it there, but essentially, if you're thinking about creating decentralized teams, you need to think about information flow within your organization. You create an autonomous team, but you don't give them the information. Let's say the CEO of the company has all of the financials, knows all of the cost effects of ordering these types of servers, not the team that you've now said, be autonomous and order whatever servers you want. They don't have the information, right? You've got to be able to take the information to the people that are making the decisions, not just give them the responsibility for the decision. Because otherwise what happens is they make the decision and they make a strange decision because they don't have the information. And then you go, see, told you it doesn't work. Not really what the problem is. So what we try to do is encourage leaders at all levels. There's a really great talk by Esther Derby. She talks about this in detail, and there's basically 3 things that she says that can help you to be able to do this. And that's basically focusing on providing clarity to the organization, so helping the organization to discover and uncover its own clarity. So we were talking earlier about things like social contracts. What's the agreement? Do we have some kind of interface between us? If you think about it from a tech perspective, if you're designing an API and you don't specify how it works, it's kind of hard to get any kind of reasonable response into or out of the system. You need to do the same thing with humans, right? How do we communicate? When do we communicate? What type of stuff do we need to share? You don't have to overplan it in detail, but if you leave the freedom with the team to be able to make decisions about how to change it afterwards, the enormous amount of power that happens from that. So that's the clarity. The other one is take care of the conditions, and that means things like design of the workspace, making sure that people have enough support, that they've maybe even eaten correctly, that their teammates are working together, like anything that is environmental or situational. Take care of these things. And the final one is set appropriate constraints. So the example that I gave was like, let's say you give a bunch of engineers unlimited access to Amazon Web Services, and you say, make this thing as fast as all hell. Pretty soon you're going to get a bill for like $1 billion. Yeah? I mean, they're optimized for the thing you asked for, right? You have to be able to set some kind of realistic constraint. And that doesn't mean it has to be hard constraints. If you look at some of the stuff I mentioned Cynefin earlier, Dave Snowden talks about the type of constraints that you should set based on the system you're working in. But basically what you want to be able to do is make sure that people are clear. Here is a thing you should always do, here's a thing you should never do, hard constraints. Softer constraints are things like, you know, if we run into this kind of expenditure on servers, maybe we should have a conversation about when do we upgrade, some kind of planning or information sharing. So that's quite a bit of kind of context in terms of setting what, like, how we think about the organization. And as we've gone along, basically there's a lot of things, as I said, that have changed, and there's a lot of things that we've learned along the way. So this has maybe been a little bit sort of more meta or broad, but I want to take you into 3 specific examples of things that we've tried or changed over time. If you've read the papers, or maybe you haven't, it doesn't matter, but I'll try to paint a bit of a picture of how that's worked. So the 3 specific things, essentially, it's about strong mission containers. It's about the shift from technology as a sort of an isolated silo to what we call tech product and design, or TPD. Every code company has to have a bunch of acronyms. This is one of ours. I have plenty more if you want them. And then the last one is just around budget experiments and how we've done some sort of playing around with that. So strong mission containers. I'm going to read the slide. I know that's bad presenting style, but strong mission containers amplify purpose and make it common, right? everybody follow me when I say mission containers? Does this make sense? No? Cool. I will explain it. I have a nice, helpful slide. So, when we started out with Spotify, we had a bunch of teams. And first we had one team, and then we had two teams, and then we had three teams. And they were all kind of doing things, and eventually teams started to kind of drift off in different directions. One team is pursuing this thing, another team's pursuing that thing. And we said, well, we've also got to have some way maybe to start to scale the organization. So this is a little bit simplified. We didn't start this with 3 teams. We started this when we got to about 20 or 30 teams, I think it was. But that line around the edge is essentially the boundary around those teams in the sense of, like, I mentioned tribes earlier, so it's a grouping around. So that may have been a bunch of infrastructure teams, or maybe a bunch of teams that built like release tooling, or some teams, basically all client-facing features, that sort of thing, all integrations into third-party partners, something like that, right? So we grouped it around a couple of different things, but what you notice here is that the line around the team is really, really strong, right? And that's the mission container that I'm trying to illustrate. So a mission is basically, when you create a company, the CEO or some product lead or something will say, I think we should go in this direction, right? That's kind of your mission, right? And that's a constraint. That's a type of constraint that they may set on the organization. As it grows, you need some way to be able to divide these up. And so you end up with smaller missions, maybe figure out a way to make our infrastructure scale to 10 million users. Figure out a way to be able to integrate into Tesla, or figure out how to build an awesome PlayStation client, something like that. Those would be smaller examples of mission containers. Does that make it a little bit clearer? So when we started out, these containers were fairly loose, but specifically at the tribe level, they were kind of arbitrary. So everybody who builds infrastructure doesn't really have a common purpose other than infrastructure, which is a little bit loose. So we're not really set up to kind of collaborate and work together, and we just kind of, oh, well, you guys do networking, and we do databases, and you guys do, service discovery or whatever. So over time, we figured out that a better way to do this was to actually have a mission container around a group of squads. And this is something that's not really captured in the earlier paper that I referenced. What this starts to do is it starts to create this sort of, I guess, a North Star, if you will, for a bunch of teams. In a smaller company, like I said, if you maybe 50 or 30 people or something, it's maybe less of a struggle because everybody can kind of understand it. You can talk to your CEO, you can get an idea of it. But once you start trying to scale it and focus it, so we start introducing things like maybe some metrics or some way to communicate around it and say, okay, so our team is doing infrastructure, and the way that we judge the success of this infrastructure is service availability. And that's a combination of servers on, services themselves are responding and discoverable, and the network is working. All of those are necessary. So now we're starting to create a common purpose between these teams, and it starts to make a little bit of sense. Over time, what we found is that we started to move to a point where the mission container around the tribe started to become a lot stronger. And part of the reason for this was that once you have a metric or some sort of objective in place, teams start to understand, hey, so the network's actually fine. The problem is the servers keep falling over, right? It doesn't make sense to have everybody working on the network, trying to make it the best network, because the better network is not going to make the servers up any more often. That's not our problem. So you start to see people basically moving around, saying, hey, maybe I should work on that thing instead, maybe I should work over here. Yeah? So essentially you end up in what I call, it's maybe too fancy a word for it, but responsive constellations, right? So within a tribe, within a group, the tribe I work in is about 50 people. And on any given day, somebody might say, yeah, I think we're done with this thing. Like, we've kind of wrapped up that. I'm going to go and help this team out over here. We're doing some analytics work. I'm going to work on the analytics tooling or the integration stuff. I'm going to leave that thing about, the startup page or whatever. I'm going to leave it alone. But by making that constraint, that border, that boundary, setting that mission container clearly, it gives the team the ability to be able to make that decision. I don't come in as the coach, or the product director doesn't come in and say, we need to go in that direction. They set a very broad thing. We want services available. You guys figure out how to do it. It's a little bit more. And then there's the supportive step. So it's not quite like the Dilbert that I showed you earlier, but they're still there and available, saying, well, what do you need? How can I help you? oh, we need more money for servers, or we need this, or we need that, or we need the next thing. Yeah. The shift from tech to TPD. So TPD being tech, product, and design, as I said. In any organization, as you grow, you tend to start getting these sort of departments. We had technology, which was all of engineering and management. Then we had product, which was a separate reporting line. And then at some point, we decided to hire some designers. I think it was a great idea, because before that, we had all the engineers designing everything, or the product people designing everything, which was also a little bit strange. So we brought a bunch of people in with expertise, but we put them on a separate floor in a different department with a different reporting line, right? How well do you think they work together? Designers over here saying, you guys never build our designs. Tech saying, you never thought about the feasibility of this thing. It's completely undoable in some ridiculous amount of time. Product going, metrics, metrics, metrics. Yeah? So what we figured was, this is like, I mean, if you look at the original picture, what we had was this sort of tribe lead up in the left as a single role, and we also had the product owners sitting outside of the squad. And that was great at first, because every first version needs to ship at some point. And we started it, and we learned as we went along, right? So we started to notice that there was a challenge with this. Basically, the product owner was kind of this guy. Yeah? So we decided it's much better to have the product owner inside the team. So we now consider our product person. So the product person is a little bit different from, it was kind of a subtle change in the role. We didn't want this product owner to be the sort of, this is what you should do, that's what you should do, that's what you should do. It should be the person who's bringing some of that information, saying, so I went to London and I saw users using our product, and it sucks in the following ways and it rocks in the following ways. What do you guys think we should do about it? And having a bit of a conversation, like talking about it, working together. So that integration really made a big difference. Yeah. Cool. The second part of it was that at the C level, what we started to see was that tech, product, and design, so the CTO, the chief product, and the chief of design, started to refer to themselves as a team, and basically saying, this is our mission. These are the core metrics that the company as a whole cares about, right at the top level. Communicating, sharing it, saying this is what's going on. And most importantly, working off a single backlog. It's one of the things that I find fascinating. You have like 6 different backlogs. Like, which one comes first? Oh no, we have a meeting to do that. Like, okay, but then why are you spending time independently prioritizing it? There's all kinds of strange things that start to happen there. If you're trying to put it into a single pipe, start that way. Yeah. The problem with having the tech, product, and design kind of at this sort of team level and then having the same thing at the bottom level was that the mid layer ended up with these really weird sort of reporting lines, and you get into all kinds of, I was going to try to find a word that's different to politics, but essentially the designer over there reports to the person who's head of design. So what does that make them relative to the person who reports to 2 more people before the CTO, right? 2 people at the same level. There's all kinds of weird things that start to happen with that. Also, what you have and start to have happen is that the head of design ends up with a lot of people reporting to them, and so they're really busy. And you're not having this sort of equal communication. These 2 over here have a meeting, and nobody from design is present, so design's still not involved in the conversation, that kind of thing. So just like when we grouped the 3 at the C level, we decided to do exactly the same thing at the tribe level. Now what we're finding happening is that all the way through the organization, this single backlog effect is taking place. We're working off one priority list that it rolls up in terms of different levels of detail, but we might say, so I'm trying to think which one I could actually mention. Let's say we're going to launch on PlayStation, for example. That's like a company bet. We want to partner with Sony and we're going to build a PlayStation client. There's like 7 or 8 different teams that work on that because there's infrastructural effects, there's all kinds of strange like product integration, design, research, all sorts of things. But then you start to divide it up a little bit and you say, okay, cool. Within the tribe space, here are the 6 different parts that are built and here's how we're going to coordinate and communicate that. So essentially what you end up with is this sort of a fractal pattern where the same cycle of having 3 people, I didn't actually mention it, but at the squad level, you end up with exactly the same pattern. So you've got product, tech, and design basically working together, at all layers of the organization. So all things are being, it's maybe a bit generous to say all things being treated equal, but it's a lot closer to that than when we had completely separate reporting lines and these completely different functional ways of thinking about things. Cool. So just like physical space and proximity to each other has an effect on silos and people's ability to work together, budgets have this effect as well. They tend to also often run along those lines, but budget has an effect in many ways. It depends on where you allocate money. You make one area big and powerful, and it starts to spend a lot of money, it starts to grow, it starts to become attractive, it sucks employees from another part of the company. Or maybe you end up in a situation where, because the budget is dealt with in a certain space, others don't get to influence the decision making. When you turn into an 1,800-person company, not everybody can have a say on the budget. I mean, that's just, it's not possible really in any size company. One of the places where this was particularly challenging was that, I have an extra slide for some reason. Essentially, you ended up in a situation where the budget was handled completely at a TPD level. And the idea behind this was that it makes perfect sense, because what we do is we just allocate money, and not everybody has to deal with all the admin of budgeting and so on. Now, I want to give a caveat that budget... You're wasting your beer? Oh, okay, that's fine then. Budgeting at Spotify is not a big thing. It's not a heavy audited process. I mean, it's audited from a compliance perspective, but it's not like finance people running in and saying, you spend 3 cents too much and that's not allowed. I basically had someone in finance say, like, we're in a lucky situation where we're funded and we're in a heavy growth stage. So we care about the money we spend, increasingly more so, but we're not in a situation where, let me frame it another way, basically, the amount of money that it costs to have me at the company, or the money that I could spend, the return on investment is orders of magnitude higher than the cost. So if I spend $10,000 on this thing, it doesn't matter, because the thing that I spent $10,000 on over here makes us $1 million. So it's that kind of a gearing ratio. So we're lucky in that situation. It's not something that every organization has, but that is our situation right now. But essentially what happened was we said, we don't want everybody to have to worry about all of these budgets. It's much easier if we just do it at the C-level. And we ended up basically with the tribe lead saying, well, the problem with that is that I don't actually get to decide exactly who I hire or how I spend money. I have to go to the C-level and say, hey, can this person travel to New York? Can this person do something? And for a little while that worked, but pretty soon it got to the point where it was just far, far too much detail, and the tribe leads didn't have any control. So we said, awesome. Let's give the tribe leads a budget and basically say, if you think about it in terms of levers, those of you who've worked in strategy, we kind of think about it in the sense of like, something that we want to have heavily differentiate the client, we will spend a lot of money on, but something that we don't really think is a big differentiating factor, like, maybe I shouldn't give an example, but basically something that's less important in terms of it's not going to change the face of Spotify, we will spend slightly less money or keep the investment the same. Like, we think about it that, so infrastructure, for example, is actually a good example of this. We think that infrastructure should be able to scale relative to the growth of clients rather than exponentially. Whereas if you're doing new feature development or partner integrations, the more money you spend, the more return you should get. You should spend more money on it. So the way that the leads now think about it is they say, okay, this tribe roughly works on these things, let's give them X amount of money. And this tribe works on these things, let's give them that amount of money, and let them figure out how they want to spend it based on their mission. The challenge with this is that once you move that budget to the tribe level, it becomes much harder to move headcount around within the organization. So you end up with chapter leads saying, hey, I've got this person who's been working in mobile dev for absolutely ages, and they want to try out doing web dev or back-end development, but they need to move to another tribe to do that. And it's like, now you have to get 2 tribe leads to talk to actually agree to that, which is a little bit more challenging. So there's a couple of things that we've done to try to combat this, is that we've created this sort of internal job portal where people can start to talk about different things, advertise positions. We've tried to talk about it and promote this idea of keeping movement going from a knowledge sharing perspective, and there's a lot of things that are beneficial about that. But it's definitely one of those things where it's kind of a byproduct of some things, but you have to try these things and see what's going to work. Essentially, we're just learning as we go. And I think it's good to be able to run these experiments. So, you remember the story about the yarn theft? The Toyota one that I said I probably shouldn't talk about in Germany. Essentially, the idea behind all of this and the picture that I'm trying to paint with these different experiments that we've run is that it's a continuous evolution. We're trying something and seeing what works and learning how to learn, essentially. We want to be the best at getting better, and in order to do that, we have to run lots of experiments, try lots of stuff. So if I came back and talked to you in a couple of months, you would probably hear a bunch of different things that we're trying, because some of these things will work really well, maybe some of them won't work so well. And we'll have to see and try new things as we go. So if you're in an environment where continuous evolutionary change is the only way to actually make progress and move forward, we have to hope that you're really not like Grumpy Cat, because you're going to end up pretty unhappy. Change is really kind of the only constant in our industry. If you get lazy and complacent, you end up in a situation where somebody else eats your lunch, and then that's your smile. So I said there were three things that we were really trying to do inside the culture that I think enable this kind of experiment to happen on a grand scale. And that's to celebrate learning, both from failure and from success. To encourage collaboration, specifically by breaking down the silos that normally inhibit them in a lot of organizations. And to encourage leaders at all levels, specifically through mentoring and coaching and guidance. And I think that this is essentially in this constantly changing environment. This is what makes Spotify successful. So the first time I did this talk, and a couple of times since then, I've had people come up to me and say, but we're special. Our organization's different in some ways. We don't have time to change. And my response to that is, change is not essential, but neither is survival. It's your choice. People won't work if we don't tell them. I say, well, if nobody's working in your company because you didn't tell them, it sounds like you've got a lot of dead wood inside your company. Yeah. So I said, well, there's only two ways the wood got there, the dead wood got there. It's either you hired it as dead wood, or you hired live wood and killed it, right? So either of those two things are solved in different ways. Stop hiring people who are unmotivated to work in your organization, or stop whatever kind of sucky practices you have on the go that are making people uninspired. And the last one, teaching, mentoring, coaching. It takes time, it's expensive, and it's, nobody's working when they're on courses and learning and blah, 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 blah. Yeah? Sorry, this thing's stabbing me in the ear. So someone once said to me, we teach them all and they leave. I said, what if I teach them what if you don't teach them and they stay? Yeah? It just doesn't make any sense, really. You've got to invest in your people. It's really, really, really important. So you might be wondering, where should I start? I've covered a lot of different things, and maybe there's some stuff that you can take away or things that you're inspired to try to. I'm happy to talk to people afterwards and have a bit of conversation. I'm also on Twitter if you want to chat to me. But the three things that I think are really important that you could take away with you today is get a mentor or a coach. Like, go out there and find somebody who's walked a path similar to the one that you want to. You will learn so much from somebody else. It will really save you a lot of time. You can basically circumvent some of the mistakes that you may make. The second one, is go to the Gemba. You know the word Gemba? It's a Japanese word from the lean community that means go to the place of work and see where it's happening. A lot of the time I hear people saying, these people over there, they're not working. I'm like, well, what are they doing? Oh, I don't know. Go look. Go hang out with the people. Go see what's happening, Understand the circumstances that you're trying to sort of armchair quarterback or manage from a distance or second guess. This applies to everybody. It's not just for managers. You're trying to work with a team over there and you're having troubles with it. Go there and see what's going on in their life. Go understand their context, their reality, before you start throwing suggestions from a distance. And the third and final one is to start experimenting. We had no idea what we were doing when we started Spotify. Really, I mean, you talk to the CEO and the co-founder, they had an idea for a product. They were like, this thing might work, but how is it? I mean, they had no idea that it was going to work. Start out experimenting, and then all of a sudden, hey, people really like this thing. Look at that. That's amazing. Now we need to hire somebody. Okay. Have you hired before? Well, a little bit. Have you hired 1,800 people? Have you grown one of the biggest companies? Hell no. You only figure it out by experimenting and by trying. It's really the only way to get there. And if that's not enough, these are some books that I would recommend. First one, basically about how time-based competition is important, as the subtext says there, but essentially is the idea that you need to be able to be really responsive in order to be able to do things. And they talk about a bunch of different examples from many different industries. Second one kind of builds on the previous one, but you can read it independently. Anti-Fragile is one of, not the first book, but it's a really great one. It talks about how systems respond to change and how you can think differently about organizations. And Obliquity, that's one of my favorite reads of the last year and a half. It's really, really excellent. Give it a read. It's hard to describe, but it's basically about how goals are best achieved indirectly. Give it a look, see what you think. And yeah, that's me. Thank you. Hopefully you have some questions. Hopefully I didn't answer everything in advance.
Hi, thanks for the talk. How many of these mission containers you have inside Spotify? Is there a maximum number you have inside?
I wouldn't say there's a maximum number. I mean, there may be a theoretical maximum at some point, but I wouldn't know what that is. In tech, we have well over 100 of those at sort of the squad level. And then at the tribe level, I think there's about 30 or something. It changes constantly, like I say. I mean, yeah. And then the layer above that, which I didn't really touch on, is called alliances, but that's kind of like a big department. There's 6 of those. So different levels.
At start on the pictures, the squads and tribes, you had the chapters, and you said the chapter is the reporting line.
Yes.
How is it working?
It's a big question. So the question is, how does a chapter work? There's 2 variations, or 2 common variations of this. One is that you have a chapter lead who is a domain expert in a subject. So let's say you're a data engineer or you're a network engineer. You report to somebody who's kind of like a team lead, if that makes sense. The primary purpose of that role is sort of the one-to-one mentorship and personal development, like helping and supporting that growth. They're also responsible for some administrative things, approving leave and those sort of things that are unfortunately necessary when you get really big. But it's not a task assignment role. It's really personal development and growth based. The other model is that you have a person who is a mentor or coach still. That's common, but maybe not a domain expert. And that's something that we've been trying as well. The logic basically goes that if I am busy helping people grow, I'm probably not spending a lot of time keeping up being a domain expert in something, because that's a full-time job. And so it's probably better to leave that to those people in certain domains. So we haven't used that universally, but in some contexts it does make sense. Chapters tend to have meetings as a group. They usually have a common domain knowledge area, but they're smaller than a guild. So a guild would be something like all mobile engineers, which is maybe 100 or so, but a chapter would be typically about 6 or 7. So it's a close-knit group of people who would help each other out, learn from each other, grow, develop, and kind of work together in sort of not the same teams, but in sort of a similar type of area generally. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. Okay. So the chapter is, for example, 6 Java engineers, and there's one team lead who takes care that the personal development of each of them is going forward.
So when I say takes care, it's more like they have responsibility to help and support people. So my manager, for example, doesn't tell me what courses to take and where to go, but will challenge me with questions like saying, so what's your plan for 2016? What do you want to grow on? Can also act as a facilitator, like maybe checking with others and seeing how's the feedback going, like talking to other people that I work closely with and asking them for their insights maybe that they haven't shared with me. That could sound like it's maybe sort of secretive or manipulative, but like I would have that conversation, but maybe they would have a slightly different conversation just to kind of get the context. The chapters tend to span teams, so it's very rare that in fact, I don't think there's a single instance where all chapter members are in the same team. They tend to be in different teams. So you get things like, our team over here is experimenting with this tool or this way of thinking, this type of practice, whatever, and then they share it with somebody in this team, and the community of practice is kind of around that chapter, if that makes sense. There's a lot of different things that it has benefits for, and there's a few variations of it, but that's kind of in a nutshell. So, thanks. Cool. Yeah, I was just going to say, I'd like to encourage people. I want to talk to you guys. I traveled, well, not that far, but I traveled a few hours on a plane. I came here to hang out with you guys and to meet you and to hear what you have to say. I'm interested to hear what you're doing as well, not just necessarily answering questions, but any format is fine. So give me a shout. As I said, I'm on Twitter as well. You can mail me, Cliff@Spotify. Yeah, it's been really awesome to be here.